Did you know the U.S. Constitution only requires the federal government to do one single thing? And, well, arguably, that one mandatory job is the job it's doing the worst right now. Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a major constitutional paradox here.
Right.
On one hand, you've seen the headlines, right?
Mhm.
Federal agents deployed to quell what some critics were calling, war-ravaged Portland.
Mm-hmm.
But then on the other hand, you see these massive spending bills. Billions, trillions maybe? And they seem to completely ignore military modernization.
Yeah, just sidestep it.
So the core question we're asking is the federal government actually failing at its #1 constitutional priority, national defense, while at the same time aggressively overreaching into local stuff, like street policing?
And we're digging into the legal arguments that suggest America is, well, sacrificing the shield, maybe, in order to become the domestic police force.
Interesting way to put it.
We've looked at sources focusing on the constitutional structure itself, federal authority, the current state, which seems pretty concerning of America's defenses, and also the ideological fight driving federal intervention in, well, domestic violence situations.
So what's our mission here today?
Our mission is really to understand the legal and, yeah, the ideological arguments behind this view that the federal government is neglecting its primary job while maybe overreaching in local affairs.
Especially, it sounds like, when those local officials are seen as maybe failing to enforce the law?
Exactly. That's a key part of the argument.
Okay, so we have to start with the Constitution itself, right? Because the founders didn't just, casually mention national defense in the preamble. It wasn't just a suggestion.
No, not at all. And what's really fascinating here is how defense isn't just dominant in the founding documents. It's set up as the constitutional priority. And, crucially, it's framed as the only mandatory function assigned to the national government.
Only mandatory. Okay, that's a huge distinction.
Go.
Because Congress can pass laws about healthcare or education, maybe. But this is something they absolutely must do.
That's the argument. Yeah. Look at how they structured Article 1, Section 8. Congress gets 17 separate powers listed out.
Mm-hmm.
But 6 of those deal exclusively with national defense. That's a huge chunk of power focused on one thing. Declaring war, raising armies, providing for a navy. It just outweighs everything else in terms of constitutional focus.
Wait, so if defense is mandatory, like you said, why isn't the president just the commander-in-chief? I mean, where do domestic duties really fit into that Article 2 description?
Well, the structure itself speaks volumes, right? The only substantive government function specifically given to the president in Article 2 is command authority. He's the commander-in-chief, full stop.
Okay.
And when it comes to protection, the Constitution actually shifts its language. It goes from being permissive to being mandatory.
Oh.
Think of it like this. The Constitution tends to use may for most other things Congress does. They may pass this law or may regulate that. But for protection, the language flips to shall. Article 4, Section 4 requires the United States to guarantee to every state a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion.
Shall, not may.
Shall. That shall is basically the Constitution saying you absolutely must do this job first. It's non-negotiable.
And just to hammer that point home, they made sure the states couldn't really interfere with this federal job, right? They were locked out.
Precisely. States are specifically told they can't keep troops or warships in peacetime. They can't engage in war without Congress saying okay.
Unless they're actually invaded, I guess.
Right, unless they're literally being invaded. But otherwise, the whole framework sets up defense as the exclusive priority mandatory job of the federal government.
Okay, so that's the constitutional mandate, clear as day. Now let's talk about the irony, the situation today. What happens when we look at the actual measurable state of our defenses?
Yeah, the irony is pretty stark. Critics argue that as the federal government has gotten bigger and bigger spending, for example, you mentioned the stimulus, $787 billion on one bill.
Yeah.
It has actually performed its core defense job less effectively.
Yeah.
That specific stimulus bill, sources point out, had not one single dime for military procurement or modernization. Zero.
Wow. That really does seem like a staggering misalignment, especially when you look at the actual numbers on military readiness.
It is. The sources we looked at suggest America faces, well, greater danger today than maybe any time since the late 1940s, with communism threatening Europe back then.
Okay.
Yet the military itself is demonstrably weaker than it was at the end of the Cold War.
Good.
Just look at these facts. The Navy, smallest it's been since 1916, and it's still shrinking.
Since 1916.
1916.
Mm-hmm.
The Air Force is the smallest it's been since Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And the average age of its planes and equipment, 23 years old.
And I saw that detail about the bomber fleet. That half are basically antiques by civilian FAA standards. What does that even mean? Why compare them to civilian standards?
It's really just a way to illustrate the age problem dramatically.
Yeah.
Half of our strategic bombers, the planes meant for, major deterrence,
Right.
are so old that if they were flying passengers, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, would classify them as antiques. They'd need massive, costly upgrades or just be taken out of service.
So it just highlights how old the core equipment is.
Exactly. And there are no firm plans on the books to replace them quickly.
Okay, that sounds like we're kind of letting the shield crack, maybe even intentionally, and this decline is happening just as global threats are picking up steam, right?
Absolutely. This weakness comes just as threats are intensifying. You have terrorism, where the momentum seems to have shifted. A bipartisan commission warned quite a while ago, actually, that it was more likely than not terrorists would use a weapon of mass destruction against a Western city by 2013. And then there's China, rapidly increasing military strength, developing advanced missiles that could potentially deny the U.S. Navy access to key places like the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah, I've read about that.
We're building like 5 submarines a year, and they possess probably the world's most far-reaching cyber warfare capability.
Okay, so we've got this picture. A dangerously weak external shield, arguably being neglected, but internally, when local law and order seems to break down, the federal government shows no such hesitation.
Right.
Let's pivot now to places like Portland. That same federal power was suddenly asserted with, well, full force. What's the justification for that kind of intervention, constitutionally or ideologically?
Well, the justification really boils down to 2 main points. First, this idea that the primary duty of any government is domestic tranquility, keeping order.
Okay, basic function.
And second, a really fierce critique arguing that state and local leaders had simply, quote, surrendered to mob rule.
So not just a failure, but an abdication.
That's the framing used by advocates for federal law enforcement action. The view is that the violence wasn't just protest, but actual criminal acts by rioters, arsonists, and left-wing extremists.
So they're not just labeling them as criminals, but specifically as politically motivated threats. Threats to the system itself.
That's the core argument presented in the sources, yeah. They characterize the actions as a sustained assault on the life and property of citizens and also on monuments. They cite things like the toppling of the statue of Ulysses S. Grant, an abolitionist general, or vandalism of WWII memorials.
Right.
And the critique is that local officials lost the will or the desire to stand up to the radical fringe, basically allowing this destruction to continue.
And Portland really became the poster child for this perceived local failure.
It did. Federal authorities actually described this city as war-ravaged. Local Democratic leaders, the governor, the mayor, they were heavily criticized in these sources for rejecting federal help and even restricting their own local police forces.
And what were the consequences cited?
Well, the consequences cited were pretty severe. The city saw a huge spike in homicides, like a 144% increase between 2019 and 2021.
Wow.
Plus millions in damage just to federal buildings alone. So for these law and order advocates, this local abdication, this failure, it basically triggers a federal obligation to step in, at least to protect its own assets and arguably the functioning of the system.
Okay, so this sustained disorder, as they saw it, triggered a really aggressive federal response, using tactics, you said, normally saved for organized crime. What specific federal tools were actually used against these groups described as organized rioters?
The stated federal policy was to prosecute the violence and destruction to the absolute fullest extent of the law. And importantly, to treat these groups not as spontaneous protesters, but as criminal enterprises.
Aiming higher up the chain.
Exactly, targeting the logistics, the organizers, the funders, not just the person throwing the rock, so to speak.
So they reached for statutes designed to take down conspiracies, basically.
That's right. They focused heavily on things like property destruction. Federal law gives up to 10 years for willful injury to federal property. But critically, they also invoked the Anti-Riot Act.
Okay, what does that do?
That statute specifically criminalizes traveling across state lines with the intent to organize, promote, or participate in a riot. And this was seen as vital because arrest records apparently showed some individuals being arrested in multiple cities like D.C., then Portland, then Kenosha.
Suggesting coordination.
Suggesting an organized, coordinated effort, yeah.
And I remember hearing about RICO, too. The RICO statute, that's usually associated with, like, the mafia How does that fit in
Yeah,
here?
that's right. The Argo Statute Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act was proposed as a tool here. The idea was to investigate and prosecute the organizations themselves, the organizers, maybe even the funders, for engaging in a pattern of racketeering activity.
And racketeering includes things like arson.
It includes arson, obstruction, and a whole list of other crimes. ARSCO lets prosecutors go after the entire enterprise, a whole organization, by showing this repetitive pattern of criminal acts. It treats these groups less like protesters and more like, well, organized crime syndicates.
But wasn't there pushback? Didn't federal enforcement run into problems with local judicial officials? Created some conflict on the ground.
Absolutely. And that brings up what the law and order advocates call a major challenge, the rogue prosecutor problem.
Rogue prosecutors.
Yeah, the argument is that some local officials, like the Portland district attorney cited in the sources, dismissed a lot of charges that didn't involve, say, deliberate property damage. They claimed they were taking the chaos of a protesting environment into account.
So giving leeway.
Critics called it a warped abuse of prosecutorial discretion that essentially allowed the violence to continue. And some sources even suggested the Department of Justice should think about withholding grant money from local DA offices that refuse to enforce state criminal laws.
Using funding as leverage.
Kind of incentivize a return to what they see as a stricter application of the rule of law.
Okay, so let's try to pull this together for you, the listener. We've seen that constitutionally, national defense seems to be priority number one, the mandatory job. But it's the very thing the federal government is accused of neglecting, right? With an anti-military inventory, shrinking fleets.
Right, neglecting the shield.
But then, when domestic law and order seems to break down locally, that same federal government asserts its power very aggressively, using heavy-duty organized crime statutes to tackle violence that stems from what it defines as, well, local government failure and mob rule.
And this raises a really important, maybe uncomfortable question right at the heart of the American system. If you accept the premise, and it is a premise, that local and state governments have somehow lost the will to enforce the law, to protect citizens and property, does the constitutional mandate to protect each of them against invasion, or maybe by extension, against widespread domestic anarchy, does that justify deploying federal, almost paramilitary forces deep inside American cities, even if the local officials are strongly objecting?
That tension.
That tension, exactly, between maybe a dangerously weak national shield on one side and a potentially overreaching domestic police force deployed because of what's framed as local, often progressive, failure on the other. That balancing act, or maybe that imbalance, is really the core of the American security debate today.